Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Crisis Communications, Best Practices for Worst Times. This webinar is sponsored by the Legislative Information and Communications Staff Association, one of NCSL's professional staff associations. My name is Jennifer Stewart, and I'm NCSL's liaison to Links, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information, exchange, and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type your questions and answer any questions in the chat box on your screen. To begin building some comfortability with the chat function and to also learn who is on the line today, I invite you to type in the state from which you are calling now, and we will hold a formal Q&A after our presenters are finished presenting. I want to briefly mention the resources. Above the presentation, you will see a couple tabs with one of them labeled as resources. Here you can find and download a PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation. Another tab is labeled Speaker, where you can read the bio of today's speakers. You can access these tabs at any time during the presentation. The webinar platform we are using is optimized in Google Chrome, for use in Google Chrome. While other web browsers such as Firefox may work, we recommend anyone experiencing technical difficulties try signing on to Chrome instead. If you continue to experience technical issues, please email registration@ncsl.org, where our team is ready to assist you. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within a week. So now that housekeeping is out of the way, let's get back to why we're here today. Joining us today are two speakers from Washington State. Jen Hansen is one of 8 public information officers for the Washington State House of Representatives, specifically for the Republican caucus. She is responsible for all communications for 6 House representatives and serves as the caucus communications lead on 4 House committees. She also handles all social media for the caucus as the social media coordinator. We also have Craig Ginn, who is the Deputy Director of Security, Emergency Preparedness, and Safety for the Washington State House of Representatives. Craig has worked for Washington State for over 10 years as an emergency manager, risk manager, and in his current role with the House. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jen and Craig, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. This is Jen here. A quick side note as we get started, I'll be providing information over what's written on the slides and not just reading what's in front of you. So I just want to give that side note for anybody that's taking notes to know that I won't just be reading, but to listen and read at the same time. And with that, Craig and I both thought that the best way to get started was to provide some definitions and reminders of the difference between what a crisis and an emergency is as you put together and craft your crisis communications plans, which I will go over later in this presentation. Knowing some simple key terms will make a difference in how you put your message together. The next 2 slides provide a few samples of what events would be considered an emergency and/or a crisis. As you can see here, there's a few listed. They're probably not anything new that anybody doesn't know. The next slide is a crisis. As I've pointed out, there's a difference between the two. There can and will be some crossover if an emergency turns into a crisis. COVID is a good example of a crossover type event. And if at any point any of us are going too fast or we need to repeat something, please let us know in the audience chat, as I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to look and see the information and hear what we need to present to you today. We have structured this presentation into 2 tiers. At the Washington State House of Representatives, we are fortunate to have a designated emergency preparedness person to assist when a crisis or emergency happens on the Capitol campus. Not many legislatures have this designated role. As communicators, it's important to understand your role when an internal event happens. This is the first tier of our presentation. The second tier is external crisis communications, or how we've chosen to label it, and that is your example of COVID, which is one of the reasons we're here today, is to give some some feedback and updates to you guys on how you can communicate better, and I've also included some other external communications that we will focus on once we go to that part of the presentation. But first, we'll start with internal crisis communications, and I will turn that over to Craig.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate everyone being on this webinar today. So for the House of Representatives, I send out communications to the staff as a whole and to our external stakeholders. I won't do communication with each caucus externally or individually. So I just wanted to make that clear. And like Jen said, I won't be reading the slides. So if there's any questions, put them in the audience chat, and we'll get to those as we can. So with any incident, emergency, or crisis, we need to be very clear about what happens and what we're going to communicate, because they happen unexpectedly, and we want to get that information out. So when we communicate, is this going to impact our staff, employees, or house operations as a whole? So some of the examples that we would communicate out is there an event? Is it a permanent, unpermanent, and is it, like I said before, is it going to have an impact to our staff or our staff operations? Active threat, I'll touch on most of these in a later slide, but these are just examples of the type of communication that we send out to our staff and our stakeholders. Principles. So I will touch on these. I won't read them, like I said, but what are our needs? What do we need to communicate to our staff? Is it effective? We need to make these communications an integral part of our planning. I'll touch on an incident that happened in our previous session that made us have this plan, and be very transparent. We don't hide anything from your intended audience, and be accurate. Make sure it's timely, and then make yourself available if staff or stakeholders need to get you one-on-one and have a conversation. So internal methods. So word of mouth is probably the quickest, but it may not be relevant. We do have a security partners. The Washington State Patrol has law enforcement duties for the campus, but we also have Department of Enterprise Services, which has the care and custody of the campus. Then we have our Senate security partners, and then the House security partners. So we will get together weekly. Of course, we're not doing that with COVID right now, but we still have emails and phone calls with them. Email, radio, and then our legislative security alerts, and then our communication technology, currently GovDelivery, and then we're moving to Everbridge. So planning. So you need to ask yourself, what are your protocols? So like I said, we had an incident that we decided that, we need to have clear planning in place. So I'll touch on that in a later slide. But yeah, look at these questions. Just ask yourself, do I meet these criteria, and can I answer these questions? So examples. So the Capitol campus, we have 468 acres for our Capitol campus. We are very unique in that aspect. We have 17 different buildings with, at times, up to 20,000 employees, staff, and visitors. We have a lake on our campus, and we have 3 different parks. So even though this communication may not impact the house as a whole, we still need to know what's going on the campus. So for the active threat here, we had thankfully it was not a real event, but we still had over 40 different law enforcement officers come from 5 different agencies that responded to this. So it was a very impactful event. And we did learn from that. We got a lot of training and a lot of plans and procedures in place to react to this. Bomb threat, we had internal bomb threats and external. So the communication going out in that is the bomb threat is impacting the highway licensing building on the campus. Please stay away. But we also had a different time that said active or a bomb threat in HLB Plaza Garage, which we have over 5,000 parking spots in this Plaza Garage. So it impacted how external employees other than in that building were going to access the garage and how they're going to make it home. So what I'm trying to get is all these situations that may not just impact your staff, but it may have a greater impact because you may have visitors coming to the campus. You could have all sorts of different things going on. So you have to communicate very well with your employees, but you also have to consider your stakeholders and what kind of communication you're going to have to send out to them. So examples, so word of mouth, the information not be vetted or sourced, it needs to be checked. So an example of this is we had a member of another agency heard about something, send it to an employee within our agency, and then it got out that, hey, someone's doing this, sending this information, why aren't we getting it? So, you have to vet that. Phone, it's timely. We share that with our security partners. Like I said, we have a weekly meeting that we meet and we share. So in our weekly meetings, we share, what is being out there, what's out on social media, what's being gathered in that. Is there any word of mouth stuff that's being heard? During the session, we'll share what bills may have an impact to the House. The Senate also presents what's going on with their bills and what potential impact. We could have 5,000 people on campus. So it's just, we may have to take the information and communicate, hey, on this day, expect this many potential people being on campus, and it could affect your staff or your operations. Radio, it's just between our security partners, so we have timely information that we can share. Email, regarding events, we send out an email currently about events unpermitted because nothing's being permitted right now. So we share what's going to be suspected, and we get that information from all different sources, and we share it with our partners. So in the event that it could impact our staff, because we still have a few staff coming in to our campus and our facilities, we want to make sure they're aware in case they do, because they may want to change their plans. We do have a legislative security alert, so if we have something that comes up and we need to push it to our staff, we'll meet together with our security partners and our leadership team, and we'll come up and draft that message and send it out. And then we have crisis communication technology. Currently, we use something called Gov Delivery on the campus. It is not designed to be a crisis communication tool. It's the best that we have currently. But with that, you send out a message, and we have 55,000 different recipients. Well, it gets bogged down, and someone sitting at their desk could get that message immediately, and the person sitting next to them get it 20 minutes later. So because of this, we got funding to bring in technology called Everbridge. So it's being installed for our campus as a whole first, and then Department of Enterprise Services is going to work with each individual agency to tailor-make their crisis communication suite and platform so we can push out information that way. So we're really looking forward to having that technology. So one of the things that we happened in January is we had an incident where we had an unplanned event protest that happened at formulated downtown, came into what we call our north steps, and then they came into the building and they were carrying firearms and different items, signs, which you're not supposed to. And then they went to the governor's office, and then they went to our house-controlled areas, and it really defined why we really need a good crisis communication plan. So we have a draft crisis communication plan now, and in that plan, it's who's going to receive the information, how will the information be processed and shared, so we have a decision matrix. Method of communication, is it email, is it phone, choose your audience. Timeliness of the communication, and prescriptive messaging. So we have lots of prescriptive messaging for different events. So we have one for weather. There's a weather pattern coming in. We could expect 5 inches of snow. Please prepare your staff to do this. Or the train derailed on the interstate. All traffic going northbound on that interstate is closed. Choose another route to go home. So it's different type of messaging that we have for that. And my last slide is a decision matrix. So with this decision matrix, for the House, security gets the information usually first, and then we'll decide, do we need to have a draft response? And if the answer is yes, we'll choose the audience and we'll determine the message be sent by that specific incident or crisis or event. And if the determination is no, that we don't need to send a message out, we'll just monitor the situation and we'll look back and see if it's escalating to a point where we're going to have to send that information out to our staff and possibly our stakeholders. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jennifer, and really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Before I start this section, I want to give a little bit about my background before my time in Washington. For over 10 years, I was a spokesperson and PIO in law enforcement for a sheriff's office in California. I was also a certified crisis communication specialist through the California Office of Emergency Services. For the past 5 years and currently, I am one of 8 PIOs and the social media coordinator for the Washington State House Republican Caucus. I have been the voice and face during a crisis and emergency, and now have the opportunity and role, like most, if not all of you, to be behind the scenes as a crisis communicator when our job shifts to that role. I have been on both sides of the coin, so to speak. I just want to thank all of you again for sharing your time with us today, and I hope you find our presentation valuable with tidbits to take back to enhance your communication strategies. Let's dive into what legislative external communications looks like. Before I start, I do want to put the disclaimer out there that I am going to provide examples as to what my communications team has done, how we use communications planning, and how we tackle crisis communications. Where I am a partisan PIO, and my examples are what my caucus has done, this is not a partisan conversation or a representation of what other caucuses, staff, policy writers, or everyone in the Washington House of Representatives may do. Hopefully these ideas, tricks, and templates can become a part of any legislative crisis communications toolbox. My examples will focus on 2 current crises, COVID and wildfires. Let's get started. Did you realize each one of you is already a polished crisis communicator? How, you might ask? When you are in session, you are in the throes of crisis communications every hour of every day. You are operating at 1,000 miles per hour, becoming subject matter experts on what seems like hundreds of topics, while new things, tasks, and to-dos build up. You feel like a chicken with your head cut off, at least I do. Yet you always get the data and information properly learned, gathered, and funneled and distributed to the media, your lawmakers, constituents, and stakeholders. So much of what you do on a daily basis during session is crisis communications. However, it always seems that the external crises like COVID throw us for a loop on what we are supposed to do. For crisis events like COVID, once you come down from the top of the initial shock loop, is to take a deep breath and start putting together your communications plan. Start by asking and answering these questions. I will note, for any crisis like COVID, and definitely for any natural disaster like a wildfire, earthquake, tornado, etc., if you aren't already familiar, I would highly recommend learning some key emergency management terminology like EOC, JIC, etc. FEMA offers some courses in the ICS structure. I bring that up because one of my questions on your slide is, do you know who the lead agency is for COVID? And once everything really ramped up and we realized that we were in a bigger issue than some initially thought we were going into, our emergency management division became the lead agency, partnered with the Department of Health. And because the emergency management division was involved, a JIC was formed in their EOC structure. And I know a lot of folks on my team that do not have emergency management in their background were not even sure what the heck that meant. So that's why I kind of put that little disclaimer out there, is there are some emergency management terms that are probably smart to learn just in case you're asked. I know when the JIC was set up, our governor's office actually reached out to every communications team on our campus to ask if any PIO would be willing to come in and help staff that and provide information. So like I said, it's kind of good to understand some of those actual direct emergency management functions and roles just in case you're asked as a communications professional to join in. The questions on your screen are always a good starting point to get your thought process started and begin an effective planning strategy. Regardless if you are a PIO on a team of many, a director, or other legislative staff, your role in communicating about the event will be unique to you, what you and your communications are for, and the overall voice you need to be. Take me, for example. I write for 6 House lawmakers and cover caucus communications for 4 House committees. The information I learn, gather, and funnel will be different for each member. If the crisis involves one of my committees, the voice there will also be different. The questions you see on your screen are generally where I start to ensure I don't start the information gathering process upstream without a paddle. As you have probably noticed me saying more than once in this presentation so far is the term funneling. The best way for me to visually capture your function in a crisis is a funnel. Once the lead agency or person, depending on the crisis, starts providing official event information, the floodgates will open. I'm sure everybody noticed that once COVID started, it was amazing to try and funnel the information and questions that were coming your way. Lawmakers, constituents, and the media will start to turn to you to funnel through all this information and provide answers and be that true communicative voice. I want to provide an example of how my team chose to funnel all the information and questions coming at our lawmakers, staff, and team from all the major lead state agencies involved and still involved in the COVID response. We created a nonpartisan website with every link to information and resources for COVID from all the lead agencies. We categorized everything to make it user-friendly and streamline the information. This website was not a replacement to our state's main website, coronavirus.wa.gov, but a means to give our lawmakers, staff, and legislative assistants one place to lead people to information on behalf of the lead agencies and their resources. This is the link to our website if anybody, after the presentation or if you have got several screens in front of you, want to take a look. It's a permanent slider on our homepage to make it easy and accessible to everyone. As I said, on this slide, I pulled just 2 sections out of the many. I just did the general information section to give you an idea of what kind of categories we would do for general. Like I said, we didn't just put website links in there. We actually kind of put headlines in there. So if somebody's looking for something very specific, hopefully that's easier than them having to filter through another website. We also, at the very top, it's the Jump To section, and that literally has every category that we created with all of the resources underneath those categories. This website is just one example of how you can funnel a mass amount of information, whether it's for internal use amongst your team or for public use. This also, at the starting point before we made it into a website, was just a document that my team was using. So if you don't have the resources or it's not something within your toolbox to actually create an external website such as this, like we've done, you can easily put this into a Word document or a OneNote or anything that's shareable that you can use amongst your team, if it's even easier that way, just to have all of the information in one place and in front of you. Like I said, I think it works best to also categorize specifically. Don't just use website links, so that if somebody does have a specific question, you can go, oh, you're asking about unemployment benefits that are stuck in transit somewhere. We have a, actual link for that or phone number. And that's a caveat I'll put out there too, is even though most of this right here is just website links, I did have some constituents through one of my members remind us that in any, especially crisis communications you put out, if there is a phone number available to provide that. Some of our elderly population, even though they might be able to see a website, they still do prefer kind of old means communication with just being able to call somebody. So that's just a little side note to remember when you're planning, is to make sure if there is a phone number to provide it, because not all of our audiences are tech savvy. And again, the concept of this website is meant to provide an easy avenue for our lawmaker, staff, and constituents to hopefully find the official resources they need as we all continue to find our way through COVID. To provide a secondary example, since I know COVID's on most everybody's mind, but at least if there's anybody here from the West Coast, I know that you've probably experienced, just like Washington State has, another horrible wildfire season. This way of funneling information into documents that can also be used in your communication plan, which I will go over, is another great tool for crisis or emergency such as wildfires. To provide this secondary example, we used our COVID website model to provide a document very similar with information for wildfires. I'm not sure how many of you face restrictions to your communications during election cycles, but the Washington State House of Representatives does. From late May to the end of November, or when the election gets certified, legislative communications becomes extremely limited, and every communications piece has to be approved by our chief clerk and our House counsel before we can release it. This includes helping our lawmakers with speeches, message points, literally anything that we would do during session or during an interim that is not election, during an election, actually gets frozen and, as I said, has to be approved. So it has posed quite the challenge during COVID, and that's why our wildfires funnel is only a document and not another website. But it's the same concept and another example of funneling all the information coming at us and putting it into one place. I just did a very small portion on the slide in front of you, but I wanted to use this opportunity to remind you that our election year restrictions are a good example to always think about and include possible hiccups you might encounter during a crisis. Like for us, we can't even provide information to people right now on the things that they need to know most. So always think about the hiccups in the background and how you will go around them when they come up. Funneling information definitely isn't the only thing that helps in a successful crisis communication strategy. What a great world we would live in if that were the only case. As I alluded to at the beginning of this section, our day-to-day duties as communications professionals mirrors a crisis communications professional. The one tool to create ease, goal planning, and strategy is a comprehensive crisis communications plan. Throughout the next few slides, I will provide a template on how you can potentially set up your crisis communications plan. This, of course, should be tailored to your specific legislative communications, and I'm simply providing steps to help you create your plan. If there's any questions after this presentation, or if you would like more feedback or help to tailor anything specific to your needs, you will have my contact information, and I am more than happy to help offline with anybody that still may have some questions or needs the help building one for the first time if it is your first time. This template is also meant to work and be used for any crisis event or emergency. Always start your plan with a purpose, strategy, or analysis of the crisis and what the plan should address. I would include a 30,000-foot level outline of any potential known resources, key messages, hiccups, and information in this particular section. Next, start to create an outline for the communications response to the crisis, event, or emergency. This is a good opportunity to include all your team members, their roles, stakeholders you know, lawmakers that may be involved, committee assignments that may be involved, anything within your legislative branch that will have a role in this. It's a very, and Craig alluded to this and what the House is doing with our internal crisis communications plan through the matrix. This is another good place to put something just like that into place. This section is a good section to glean from past experience. Maybe COVID is the most recent event or wildfires to use moving forward, or even creating a plan moving forward since we continue with COVID. Maybe, I mean, most of us aren't done with COVID yet, so this might be a good exercise to do an outline of where you're at now and maybe where we could be in a couple months, depending on where we see fall taking the virus. Here are some potential examples you can categorize and tier for a crisis. You can also kind of put this into a matrix or an outline or whatever works best for you. Usually what I do is I will do the tiers in one column. I will do how we're going to respond, any key messages in a second column. And then in a third column, I will do who is responsible for that communication with their contact information and kind of how they play into this entire structure. This is a good starting point and brainstorming activity to evaluate and understand what level of the crisis you are currently facing. Brainstorming in the tiered approach also helps you prepare and perhaps recognize a need for more than one crisis communications plan as the event unfolds. This is why it's important to look through the lens of a past experience as you outline a current crisis. These next two slides are the meat and potatoes of your crisis communications plan. These four areas really map out what, when, and how communications will flow for you and your team throughout the crisis event. Each area in this section could change or become more robust as the event continues. The first two areas, as shown on this slide, is all about asking important questions so you can efficiently and effectively start piecing the information gathering process together and starting any funneling boxes or areas where you know your communications is going to need more than it might in some other area. I said, and these two areas on this slide are your action portion of your communication plan. This is where you're going to put all of your funneling, all of your information gathering, everything into these two phases, especially the activations phase. You have started gathering information, and as you become increasingly updated on the crisis, it's now time to put words into action and start funneling the information to your lawmakers, constituents, the media, whoever is needing it from you. This is the part of the plan you need to pay the most attention to and will change the most throughout the process. As you put together the administration phase, which is kind of, I would see it as more of a tail end phase, I would make sure to include a post-crisis after action plan so you can then assess what worked and what didn't so you can have some thoughts ready when the next crisis hits. I also would think of a post-crisis after action plan maybe throughout each individual stage also of a crisis. COVID's a good example of that, as it seems through the waves of it, there's a different aspect and another emergency within itself as the virus and each state's response happens. I know we had that here with the initial response and our governor shutting everything down, like several other states did the same. With all of the shutdown, of course, what happened? We had massive unemployment numbers as people couldn't go to work because their businesses were shut down. We had a major surge, of course, on our unemployment system, just like probably every state in the country did. We were a little unique in our unemployment debacle when we had Nigeria steal millions and millions of dollars of our funds that were meant to go to people. So a crisis usually involves a crisis and an emergency continuing through an event. So having these different phases and steps in place are so important. So when there is a new emergency that lands in this, while you're trying to deal with the overall crisis itself, you're ready, can take a deep breath, can feel a little calmer as you've already kind of started putting the puzzle pieces into play. They're not still all scattered around the board and you're wondering where your starting point's going to be. Those last slides were definitely crisis communications planning specific. I wanted to provide another example of a crisis just a communications plan. My team uses a regular non-crisis communications plan for our day-to-day communications with our legislators. Like I said, I know all legislatures are unique in how communications are done. I know some you write for and or do the communications for an entire caucus or even the entire branch. You could just be House, you could just be Senate or Assembly. How we have it structured, at least in the House Republican caucus, we have 8 PIOs. That includes our director. He does write for 2 members, our minority leader, and then one of our budget leads. And then the rest of us are funneled through the members. Usually we have 4 to 6 different members. And then how the communications committee role works is if we have a member that is a ranking member on a committee, then we become the lead communications to also support that role for that member. So we use communications plans in our day-to-day operations just because every member has a voice, a different voice, and plans like this really help to keep things in line and make sure their voice is always captured. So the reason I wanted to include this, even though we're dealing more with the crisis communications realm today, was a lot of these buckets and how you map out your communications plan can actually work well and in tandem with the tiered approach that I gave for the crisis communications plan. So I just wanted to include those components here. They also help provide insight and topical areas that could be used in any kind of planning, crisis communications planning, regular communications planning, maybe even just mapping out how you're going to talk to somebody throughout your day. The only real difference is the tiered approach, and the immediacy that you need to incorporate into a crisis communications plan usually does not need to be in a regular communications plan. But my one tidbit of information I always like to throw out there and remind people is that any plan is meant to be fluid, not solid, so it can change in any capacity that you need it to change. This slide just shows some other components of our communications plan and how these are the sections in this slide and the next where we get into a lot more specifics and actually start mapping out what we're going to do in terms of the media relations, all of the categories there. We actually try and, if we can, throw in some numbers and, start to estimate what it is and what it's going to look like, how many of these we're going to do on what kind of timeline. Of course, session, as everybody knows, you can easily try and have examples and plan forward, and then the first day things usually get thrown away and you have to restart everything, and that's how it runs the entire time through. But usually having these guides really helps us, and it really helps our members stay on track when it's time for them, to be the ones communicating what we provide and help them create. In the last part of our communications plans that we use, same thing as kind of the slide before, we just like to really map out everything we're doing. It really helps, like I said, keep things on track. It keeps us as the communications team on track. We update these every year. We definitely update them at the end of every biennium when we start a new session after that, a new budget cycle, and of course that's after the election cycle. All of our members in the House are up every 2 years, so our election cycle, the potential for change is huge because, like I said, all 98 of our members go up for re-election every 2 years. So these plans, we just, like I said, our caucus keeps in place just so we can stay on top of it, and especially if and when we have new members that join us, we can also start to learn their voice, what their priorities are, and how we're moving forward. So as I said, I included this in the crisis communications aspect because if you look at all of the buckets and the examples underneath them, it's also a very comprehensive way to throw this information into a crisis communications plan if you do actually have the opportunity to sit down and formulate a little bit more comprehensive plans. Sometimes crisis communications planning does not afford us the opportunity to do more comprehensive plans because we're definitely in the fire, so to speak, with it. But when there is time to breathe, especially now for a lot of us with COVID, is we're just, like I said, trying to see what the fall wave might bring. Now might be a good time to look at this more regular communications plan and maybe start filtering in some stuff so that you're prepared when and if the next part of this crisis happens or anything else. I know wildfire season isn't technically over. Hurricane season, tornado season, natural disaster season, hits all of us across this country. So this is another good thing to just even prepare yourself. I'm actually starting to use these templates to get ready for session. We're heading into a horrible budget year given COVID and just the fact that it is a budget year. So I try and, do my planning a little bit ahead of time if I can, just so I'm a little bit more prepared when that ball drops. And finally, we just wanted to provide you some tidbits and information that maybe was not covered that you can take with you. Like I said, this is all of the information Craig and I have provided for you here are hopefully just some tools that you can put in your toolbox and pull them out someday if you need them. And if not, then, well, the toolbox will still look full and you'll be ready to head on to the next emergency. So I'm going to pass this back along to Jennifer so we can start any questions and answers if you guys need them. I'll kind of filter through the next, this slide and the next so you can kind of see those tips. But other than that, I thank you guys for being here and we'll conclude that part of my presentation.
Thank you, Jen and Craig. We just have a few questions here. So one question is, so if you're from a smaller state with limited resources, where do you suggest that these states focus in terms of resources, or where can they begin to formulate a plan, as you've been talking during your presentation? Do you have any advice?
This is Jen. I can go first. In terms of smaller areas, I completely understand that where a challenge sometimes happens. Like I said, when I provided the information about our website, I understand that a lot of people don't have those resources, staff, even, platforms to do it. Like I said, any good starting point is, even if you just want to make a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, whatever is your comfort zone in terms of, the basic technologies we use every day. And just I usually do is I'll just open a Word document and start copying and pasting the information as I'm getting it and it's made available to me. And then when I have the opportunity to take a deep breath, that's when I'll start categorizing it and making it work in a way that's functional for me. But then that way too, if it does turn into something that we use on a wider scale and not just for my particular office and my members, then it works. Not knowing if you have any kind of structure in place now or not makes it hard to maybe give you a little bit more specific. So feel free to reach out to me if you'd like once this is over, and I can maybe help with some other specifics, maybe having a little bit better understanding of what it is that you do and do not have. But that's the great thing about crisis communication planning, is it can definitely turn into something huge, but the starting point is really just however you do your daily communications gathering when you're doing your job as it is without a crisis is the same way you can definitely start building your plans. It can be in the simplest format possible.
Hi, this is Craig. Another thing is don't be afraid to reach out. So I know in the emergency management field, if I don't have a plan, I'll just reach out and say, does anyone have anything in regards to this item? So there's no reason to create the wheel when the wheel's already made. You just have to change the spokes a little bit to fit your needs. So don't be afraid to ask, is what I would have to share with that.
Great, thank you, Jen and Craig. Another question is, what would outside of the election season restrictions and communications and things, are there any other large challenges in during a crisis or trying to get information out that you've experienced, and how have you been able to overcome them?
So one of the things I've experienced is the over-messaging, because if you oversaturate your audience, they're going to start being dismissive. So if you're going to send a message, ensure that the message is needed and it needs to be timely, and that it's going to be helpful for the staff and possibly external stakeholders. So if they see it, they know it's really important. It's not just a message that they will disregard because they're oversaturated. So.
And Jen here, what I'll add to that on more of our communications external standpoint with that is, as I mentioned, obviously for me personally, sitting here today, election year restrictions are a huge hurdle. But outside of election year restrictions, how we overcome stuff is, I notice whether it's an emergency, whether it's a bill that blows up and turns controversial that we didn't think it would, whether it's, members are human beings and they go through issues in their own personal lives that, filter into the legislature that you do end up having to deal with in some capacity. I'm sure I know we've had that. But what I've learned the best is who's the information coming from? Who do they want? What's the question? Who's the audience? What do they want to know? And then never, ever feel like you can't say, I'm working on getting that information for you. I will get back to you. And even if it's going to take you a couple days, be honest. Say, hey, this is a big project. This is a big question. This is a big issue. Please, give me the opportunity to gather as much accurate information as I can, and just stay in touch with people. Let them know that. But it's just about, for us, we've noticed the best is sometimes we do need to slow down. It's hard, especially when it's session. But when it's not, and it's not an emergency, and there's still constant hurdles to jump, it's just important to slow down, continue to gather information. But as Craig pointed out in the beginning of his presentation, stay transparent and make sure people are understanding that, hey, I'm getting that information for you. I'm not ignoring you. I'll be back in touch. And usually, I mean, there's sometimes that doesn't work, of course, and if it's the media, it might never work. But I've just noticed transparency, but always being available. I'm always available, so even if you don't quite have it yet, I'll do what I can to give you what's immediate and something so you have a response, especially if it's a legislator. They might need to be talking about this right here and now. And then after they do that, I'll even advise them, let people know that more information will be forthcoming. So that's where, as communications professionals, we know how to jump in and at least get the ABCs done so that if somebody needs to speak on an issue, we've got something. So always find the something, but then do your hardest to just slow down then and fill in the cracks as they need to be filled. And usually it all, tapers out and you can get over the hurdle and whatever other roadblocks are in front of you.
Yeah, that's all really great information. Thank you. So one last question for you all, and I know you have the final thoughts and tips, but if Jen and Craig want to give one key number one takeaway from this webinar, what would that be to our audience?
I was waiting to see who wanted to go first. Go ahead, Craig.
Okay, I was waiting for the same thing. Thanks, Jen. One takeaway is if you don't have a plan, start beginning the planning process and developing that plan. And once that plan is developed, ensure that your staff are aware of that plan, and then train to that plan, and then exercise it. It could be a very simple exercise. It could be a tabletop exercise, but make sure that you test it and make sure that it works. That way, when the time comes that you really need it in a real life crisis, that you know that it works for your staff and your stakeholders.
And I would definitely second what Craig just said, and most importantly, know your role and be involved in the planning and information gathering process as much as possible. I know when COVID first hit us here in Washington State, in terms of our response, we were just finishing session. We almost ended session early to start the lockdown process, but we figured we would finish our business, and then the lockdown literally happened the day after session ended. With all of the uncertainties that happened, our members were on conference calls pretty much every day. I think then it turned into every week. It just depended on the need and what was going on. And a lot of our team, in terms of the communication staff, weren't involved in the calls all of the time. So it made it really difficult when a member would then get off the call and then call me and go, oh, hey, Jen, we need to put out a press release before election year restrictions happened about this. I want to make sure people know where I stand on this and what I'm doing, and, give resources. It was really hard for them not to understand that I wasn't on the call, that they were just a part of, to understand the foundation and concept of where we were going with communications, whether, like I said, it was a press release or an email update or something. So my biggest takeaway is know your own role, how you're going to be. Are you going to respond like you would if this was just another day in session or interim outside of a crisis? Find out the best ways through your chain of command, how you can make sure that you stay involved so that you are on top of all of the, spiraling information coming down at you in every way, shape, or form, and have a plan in place, even if it's just a handwritten note that's got a few key buckets ready for you to start jamming information in. Just be prepared, make sure you're in part of the information gathering process, and have your plan ready to go.
Yeah, thank you again. It's all such relevant and awesome info to be sharing. So I think we're at the end of our questions, and we're almost to the end of the webinar time. So we always encourage questions or anything after the fact. If you're looking at the PowerPoint and you are, need clarification on something, or you want advice, or any type of help at all, you can always either email or call Jen and Craig in Washington, or you can reach out to me, Jennifer Stewart at NCSL, and we will get back to you and try to help you in any way that we can. So thank you, Jen and Craig. As a final thank you, we sincerely appreciate your expertise and your time today. And thank you for everybody who participated in today's webinar. And as a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides will be available on NCSL's website within a week. So please don't hesitate to reach out to all three of us, and we hope that you have a great rest of your week.